بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. I remind you, dear brothers and sisters in Islam, to have a sincere intention in your heart when attending the lesson, seeking reward from Allah Ta'ala. In our previous lesson, we spoke about additional conditions for the prayer, and we said that these were conditions for one to gain reward for one's prayer. Because if you remember, we said one might perform the prayer and the prayer might be accepted, but without reward. So in order for the prayer to merit reward from Allah Ta'ala, there were 3 additional conditions that the person has to satisfy, and we mentioned these in our previous lesson. Then we started talking about how to perform the prayer, and we started by talking about the integrals of the prayer. And I mentioned to you that the prayer in our religion has a very high importance. Our beloved Prophet, alayhi salatu wassalam, he used to tell Bilal, for those of you who might have heard that name, he was famous for calling the adhan. So when it was time to pray, Bilal, one of the companions, used to call the adhan for the prayer. And the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam used to tell him, "Arihna biha ya Bilal," meaning that the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam used to seek comfort in praying, in performing the prayer. So when the person is going through hardships, is feeling pain or sorrow, don't leave out the prayer. Rather, do as the Prophet ﷺ used to do. He used to seek comfort in performing the prayer. When the person performs the prayer, as I mentioned to you last time, inshallah, one feels better afterwards, having done this great act of worship. So do not leave out the prayer, whether in times of difficulties and also when you are going through, happy times and you're satisfied and in good health. Do not neglect the prayer. Do not forget to do the acts of obedience, the acts of worship that Allah Ta'ala obligated you with. Don't just resort to performing the good deeds when you are desperate and you are in need. Perform them in good times and in hard times. Never leave out the obligations. So we started by mentioning the integrals of the prayer. And if you remember, we said an integral is part of the deed, and without it, the deed would not be valid. This means one has to satisfy these integrals. One has to perform these integrals for the deed to be valid. So when talking about wudu, ablution, we said that there are 6 integrals. So one has to do those 6 integrals for one's ablution, for one's wudu to be valid. And when talking about the prayer, according to Imam al-Shafi'i, radiyallahu anhu, there are 17 integrals, and one has to also satisfy these 17 for one's prayer to be valid. We also mentioned that the prayer has recommended matters. There are sunan, rewardable deeds that the person can do in the prayer, definitely. But right now in our lesson, inshallah, we will focus on the integrals. Because if you leave out an integral, the prayer would not be valid. Whereas if you leave out a sunnah matter, a recommended matter, but you perform the integrals and you satisfy the conditions, the deed is valid. But of course, it's better to do the sunnah for sure. However, if you leave out a recommended matter, a sunnah, this does not render the deed invalid. Okay, so the deed would still be valid. So inshallah, we are focusing on the integrals, those that one has to satisfy for the prayer to be valid. If you remember, we started talking about the first 3, and we said the first one is to have the intention. the place of the intention is in one's heart. So one intends in one's heart, while at the same time, one is saying Allahu Akbar, because we commence the prayer, we start the prayer by saying Allahu Akbar. So these two then you do simultaneously while saying with your tongue Allahu Akbar loud enough that you can hear yourself. You are establishing the intention in your heart. And last time we gave examples of valid intentions, okay? For instance, if you are performing the Asr prayer, you would intend that you are performing the obligatory Asr prayer, all right? While you are saying with your tongue, Allahu Akbar, loud enough that you can hear yourself, okay? Even if the people next to you don't hear you. It's not a condition that they hear you, no, that you hear yourself, okay? So, as is the case in all verbal integrals in the prayer, the prayer has verbal integrals and integrals of action. The verbal integrals, these you say loud enough that you can hear yourself. So the second integral then was to say Allahu Akbar. The third integral we mentioned is to stand when performing the obligatory prayer if one is able to. It's the third integral. It means it's an integral, one has to satisfy it. So if the person is able to stand and the prayer that he or she wants to perform is an obligatory prayer, then this person has to stand for the validity of the prayer. When able, the person has to stand. Okay, and I told you last time, we see sometimes people who are able to stand when they're making themselves a cup of coffee, when they are moving from one room to the other, they stand, for example, they wait for something. This means they are able to stand as they are standing in line at the grocery store, at the bank, for example. So since they are able to stand when performing the prayer, they need to stand. This is an integral. All right. And in case they are not able to bend down for ruku' or sujood, for example, but they're able to stand up, they start the prayer by standing up. They don't right away sit down. If the person is not able to stand up, this is where they sit down. Okay. Now, we mentioned this is a case for the obligatory prayer. So when the person is performing an obligatory prayer and one is able to stand, one has to stand. Okay. As for the recommended prayers, you know, there are prayers that are sunnah, not obligatory, then the case is different. Okay. But right now we're talking about the obligatory prayers. When able to stand, one has to stand. This is an integral. Otherwise, the prayer would not be valid. Okay, so now we move on to the fourth integral. The fourth integral is to recite Surat Al-Fatiha. Okay, so it is important then to learn the recitation of Surat Al-Fatiha from a trustworthy teacher who is knowledgeable in the recitation of the surah, a person who knows how to recite Surat Al-Fatiha properly, correctly, because you need to recite it correctly for the validity of the prayer. So if you have not yet learned the recitation of Al-Fatiha, do not delay, do not neglect that. Learn it from someone who is knowledgeable and trustworthy, okay? Learn the proper pronunciation. I have seen people who are so keen on learning the surahs from the Quran, they want to complete the whole Mus'haf, but they do not pay attention as to from whom they are learning, nor whether their pronunciation is correct or not. And this is not to be done, okay? It's not that we want to finish, but we are not taking care of reciting correctly and learning from trustworthy people just because we want to finish the whole Mus'haf. No, no. Even if you have only acquired few surah from the Quran, but you've acquired them from a trustworthy, knowledgeable person, and you know how to recite them correctly, then keep on reciting them with a sincere intention. You gain reward, inshallah. Whereas if you are reciting on your own surahs without having learned them from a teacher, you do not gain reward. Pay attention. Do not read the Quran on your own without having learned the recitation of the surah first. Once you have learned the proper recitation of the surah from a trustworthy, knowledgeable teacher, then you read on your own that surah that you have acquired the recitation from trustworthy, knowledgeable teacher. Okay, then you can repeat that surah on your own once you have learned it. But before you have learned it, you do not read it by yourself without a teacher listening to you and correcting you. There are so many people who make lots of mistakes and they're not acquiring the proper recitation. So reciting Al-Fatiha is very important to learn to recite it correctly because it is an integral of the prayer. You need to know how to recite it for the validity of the prayer. So the fourth integral is to recite Al-Fatiha. Again, you recite it loud enough that you can hear yourself. Okay, you do not want to distract others. If, let's say, you are praying in congregation, you don't raise your voice in a way that you are distracting the others. No, you say it loud enough that you can hear yourself. And you start it by saying the Basmalah, okay, because it is part of it. The Basmalah is part of Al-Fatiha. When we say Al-Basmalah, it means to say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So we start reciting Al-Fatiha by saying Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Okay? And when reciting Al-Fatiha, you need to know there are letters in Al-Fatiha that need to be doubled. There are 14 letters that are doubled. So they have a shadda in Arabic, so they need to be doubled. You need to say these correctly. I'll just give you one example now. For instance, when we recite Al-Fatiha, we say Iyyaka na'budu. We say Iyyaka. I don't say Iya. No, rather Iyyaka. Okay, so I'm doubling the letter Ya. Okay, this is an example. And there are many other places in Al-Fatiha where the letter needs to be doubled. So one has to make sure that the person is doing that when reciting Al-Fatiha correctly. And for those of you who are not native Arabic speakers, it's important that you know in Arabic there's a distinction between the sound sa and sa. These are two different letters. There is the letter sad and there is the letter sin. Okay, so one is sa and the other is sa. Sad, sin, two different letters. And there are other examples such as ta and ta. So one has to make sure to articulate the letter correctly. Okay, and that's why we say again, learn to recite the Fatiha from a trustworthy, knowledgeable teacher. I've said this before in the group, and I will remind you of that. If anyone wants to learn the proper recitation of Al-Fatiha and has not yet learned it from a teacher, feel free to send me a text message, and inshallah, I will get back to you so that I would listen to you recite it. Okay, so then one has to double the letters that are doubled when saying Al-Fatiha, and one has to observe succession, okay, and recite the verses in order. So when we are reciting Al-Fatiha, I pause to take a breath, for example, yes, but I don't leave between a verse and another verse lengthy breaks. Okay, so I need to observe the succession. And I say the verses in order. Okay, so I recite the verses of Al-Fatiha in order. I don't change the order of the verses. And of course, we need to avoid making errors while reciting Al-Fatiha, whether that error changes the meaning or not. Okay, so whether the error breaches the meaning or not. Now, however, the error that does not breach the meaning, it is sinful, but it does not invalidate the prayer if it does not breach the meaning. So you want to avoid making errors when reciting Al-Fatiha. Now, in case you do make an error unintentionally while reciting Al-Fatiha, you repeat that word, okay? So you repeat that word to say it correctly. So then the fourth integral, as we said, is to recite Al-Fatiha. Now the fifth integral of the prayer is to make ruku'ah. To make ruku'ah, what does that mean? This means to bow. So the person started the prayer standing up. One said Allahu Akbar. At the same time, one had the intention in one's heart. Then one recited Al-Fatiha. Then the fifth integral is to bow for ruku'ah, okay? To make ruku'ah. This means to bow until one's palms could reach one's knees. Notice I'm saying could reach one's knees. So it does not mean that you have to put your palm on your knee. No, you bow in such a way that your palm could reach your knees. Okay, so you bow down enough that your palm could reach your knees if you wanted to put it on your knees. Okay, so that's then the fifth integral, which is ruku'ah in Arabic, to bow until one's palms could reach one's knees. The sixth integral is tuma'nina, after bowing, for the duration of saying Subhanallah. What does that mean? So you were standing up, you bowed, okay, you made ruku'ah, you bowed. In this position, in the bowing position, there is tuma'nina. There is this integral which is called tuma'nina. Okay, and this is the sixth integral. This means for each bone to settle in its place simultaneously. So to be motionless for that short duration, the duration that it takes to say Subhanallah, it's not long. Okay, it's not a long time. And you do not have to say Subhanallah. No, that's not an integral to say it. But the integral is to have tuma'nina in that bowing position, in the ruku'ah. So once you've made ruku'ah, you remain motionless in the ruku'ah position for the duration of saying Subhanallah. Okay, and this is tuma'nina, for each bone to settle in its place simultaneously. So you have tuma'nina then, after you've made ruku'ah, in the ruku'ah position, you have tuma'nina, okay? Then we move on to the seventh integral. The seventh one is referred to as al-i'tidal. This is to straighten up after ruku'ah. Ruku'ah, and then you straighten up again. So to straighten up after ruku'ah, this is al-i'tidal. Okay, and this was the seventh integral. The eighth integral is to have tuma'nina in al-i'tidal. So you made ruku'ah, right? In the ruku'ah, the bowing position, you had tuma'nina. We explained what that is. Then you made i'tidal, you straightened up. Now in the i'tidal position, there's also tuma'nina. So again, you remain motionless for the duration of saying Subhanallah, okay? After you've straightened up, you have tuma'nina, okay? Remain motionless for that short duration. Again, you do not have to say anything, but you remain motionless for that short duration, the duration that it takes to say Subhanallah. Now, again, of course, there are things that are sunnah to say. Inshallah, in later lessons, we can go back and talk about the sunnah matters to say when in the ruku'ah position and when you straighten up. Inshallah, we'll talk about them. But as I said, right now, we are focusing on the integrals that you need to do for the prayer to be valid. So then, the seventh integral was al-i'tidal, to straighten up after ruku'ah. And then the 8th integral is to have طمأنينة in the, once you have straightened up, in اعتدال, you have طمأنينة. The 9th integral is to prostrate, to make sujood twice. You know, in each rak'ah, in each cycle, we make one ruku' but 2 sujood. Okay? So the 9th integral is to prostrate, to make sujood twice. How do we make sujood? How is this movement when we make sujood? How is that? We make sujood by putting one's or part of one's bare forehead, okay? Part of one's bare forehead on the place of the prayer, and part of one's knees and part of one's hands on the praying ground. Okay, so when we make sujood, part of the bare forehead needs to be on the praying ground, while keeping the lower half of one's body higher than the upper half, and this is called tankis in Arabic, along, as I said, with placing part of one's knees and part of the inside of one's hands and the bottom part of one's toes on the place of prayer. So for example, if these were your toes, the bottom part of one's toes on the place of prayer. Okay, so when you make sujood and part of your bare forehead is on the prayer ground, you press a little, all right, by pressing a little. So, my dear sisters, I want you to be careful. When you pray, do not let your scarf, or this part that we often put underneath the scarf, to make sure that the hair does not show, make sure that this does not cover all your forehead. Okay, when you're praying, make sure that you're not covering all your forehead, because as we just said, when making sujood, prostration, part of one's uncovered forehead needs to be on the place where you are praying. Okay, pressing a little, as I said, and we said one does tankis, that is keeping the lower half of one's body higher than the upper half, but according to other scholars, it is valid even if it is not higher. And by placing part of one's knees, part of the inside of one's hands, and the bottom part of one's toes on the place of prayer. Okay, so this is then how we make sujood, and this was the 9th integral. The 10th integral, when after you've made sujood, the 10th integral is again طمأنينة. So to have طمأنينة in that position, in prostration. So you've prostrated, you have طمأنينة. So again, in that prostration position, you remain motionless for the duration of saying Subhanallah. Again, this is not a long duration. So you have طمأنينة then in sujood. And we said there are 2 times that we prostrate in each cycle, in each rak'ah. Okay, so you have made sujood. What do you do then? The first sujood, and in the sujood position, you've had طمأنينة, then you're going to sit, right? Then you sit, and when you sit, there's also طمأنينة, okay? Then you sit, there's طمأنينة, and then again, you do the second prostration, the second sujood, and of course, now in the second prostration, the second sujood, there is طمأنينة again. Clear? So the 10th integral, as we said, is to have طمأنينة in the prostration position. The 11th integral we mentioned is to sit between the 2 prostrations. And the 12th integral is to have طمأنينة in the sitting. Now, the 13th integral is to sit for the last tashahhud. That means now if you have reached the last cycle, the last rak'ah, because if this is now not your last rak'ah, after doing the second prostration, what are you going to do if it is not your last rak'ah and you have done the second prostration and you had tuma'nina in the second prostration? What are you going to do now? If it is not your last rak'ah, you're going to stand up, right? You're going to stand up to start the next rak'ah. For example, the second rak'ah. And you start the second rak'ah now by saying Surat Al-Fatiha, by saying the Basmalah, okay? Now, if it is your last rak'ah of this prayer that you are praying, let's say you are praying in Maghrib. Maghrib prayer has how many rak'ahs, how many cycles? 3, okay? So let's say this is now your third rak'ah. So it is the last one for the Maghrib prayer. Then here, after doing the second sujood, the second prostration, and you had tuma'nina in this sujood prostration, this time you're not going to stand up anymore because now this is your last cycle. So you're going to sit. You're going to sit for the last tashahhud, okay? And what follows it, namely, as-salatu ala nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and the closing salam. So the 13th integral is to sit. So after you have sat, now what do? This is the last tashahhud. And you know, the better way is to say التحيات المباركات الصلوات الطيبات لله السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمد رسول الله. Now this is better to say all of what I said, and after you have said the last tashahhud, then you say the 15th integral, which is, as we said, as-salatu ala nabi. The minimum here, the minimum is to say Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. This is the minimum. But of course, it is better to say as-salat al-Ibrahimiyah, okay, for those of you who have learned it. But the minimum, in order for the prayer to be valid, is to say Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Notice here, brothers and sisters, I say salli. I do not say salli, okay? So for those of you who speak Arabic, I'm not adding a ya at the end. It's not salli, no, salli, okay? And it is salli, not sa, all right? As I told you before, these are two different letters. And we need to be careful when saying the name of our beloved Prophet alayhi salam, Muhammad, okay? So his name is not Muhammad or Muhammad, no, Muhammad, okay? Muhammad. Say his name correctly. And then after the 15th integral, which is as-salatu ala nabi alayhi salam, then the 16th integral is to say the closing salam. Now, the closing salam, also I want you to be careful here. We say Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Not Salamu alaikum. Okay, rather Assalamu alaikum. Okay, of course you can say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. However, to be valid, the minimum, you need to say Assalamu alaikum. Okay, you can say it a second time if you want, all right? But minimum is one time and you say Assalamu alaikum. So be careful because some people might just be saying Salamu alaikum. No, Assalamu alaikum. All right. That was the 16th integral. The 17th integral is basically to observe the aforementioned order. That is the order that we just mentioned. So we do not switch order of the integrals. What do I mean by that? For instance, we make ruku', bowing, and then comes the sujood later, right? After ruku', then comes the sujood. So I do not make sujood first before I make ruku'. So I do not change the order of the integrals. So this is then the 17th integral. The 17th integral of prayer is to observe the order of the integrals, not to change it. This is very important. And of course, you don't leave out any of the integrals, as we said. Now, what happens if somebody unintentionally forgets an integral? It might happen sometimes when one is praying and he drifts away maybe with thoughts or so, and he forgets an integral, not intentionally, okay, but forgets. What do we do then? This is, inshallah, what we will talk about in our next lesson, and we will continue talking about another topic as well. And it will take some time, as I want to give you examples to illustrate so that it becomes clear to you, inshallah. Barakallahu bikum. I hope it was clear. If you have any question, feel free to type it, please, before we end. And let's say, Lillah, seeking reward from Allah, tahleel 3 times together.